Right, using some naphtha, I'll wipe these surfaces. Judging by the colour of that grease, I'd say that was graphite grease that was on there. And I think the application was over generous. This is the focus scale ring component, and I'm making sure that I clean that. And in at the front, of course, the dust and dirt has been able to get in there. So I want all of that out. I'll take a toothpick and run it around that groove in there to loosen up the old compacted lubricant and dust, and see if I can get that nice and clean. I will be using a bit of molybdenum paste, but I won't be needing to use a lot, certainly not as much as been splashed around on this. It's worth getting this central section nice and clean, scrupulously clean, because old oils and greases there will stop the control rings from running smoothly, which means things like that can cause the diaphragm to be sluggish to move, which is more a problem with a reflex camera than a rangefinder camera. Well, this is there's a lot of grease here and probably a lot of dust and dirt too. Well, the front of the lens was surface, that was quite dusty. So it's anyone's guess what its history was. This camera is new to its owner. So wherever he purchased it, the seller may have combined a lens from another camera with the body in order to sell it. That's quite ground in, that colour there. That's interesting. Certainly doesn't want to come away. Certainly suggests to me that this lens has seen a lot more action than the camera body. Alright, that looks clean enough. I'll see if I can lift that back into place. That's certainly got quite a stiff feel to that. Oh yes, okay, that's alright, I know what that was. Effectively, this crescent here had shifted at this end, so it was pulling in too tight. Now that feels appropriate. I'll apply a little bit of lubricant, and then we can reassemble these wedges that hold it all together. Once this part's good, and I'm satisfied that it rotates smoothly, no roughness, then we're going to assemble the other components into it. Where you've got aluminium sections like this rotating in another aluminium section, if there's any rubbing between the two components, it tends to gall. The metal rubs up, effectively tears up pieces of microscopic pieces of metal, and you end up with a rougher finish again. So aluminium is a bit tricky. I need to make sure that it's all physically spaced out correctly and that there's appropriate lubricant in there. Alright, I've got to continue on assembling this lens. So I'll get together the bits and pieces here. This is one of the little wedges that hold the focus scale ring to the main body here. And it's covered in some sort of low friction material, probably something like PTFE, but some previous material. So I was quite happy with the fit of that section, so I'm just going to apply a bit of molybdenum paste into that groove. That's where those wedges run, and those wedges position, effectively they position this part in the frame, left, right, up or down. It's to stop it, to keep it centralised so it's not rubbing anywhere. That's what it's all about. Yeah, let's see if we can get this back together. That looks good. There's a bit of fluff there. What was that? That was a bit of cotton. Must have come from the cotton bud. So this wedge goes in there. This post here, I'll zoom you in a bit. This post with the spring on it, I didn't disturb that. I didn't want to disturb that position because it's hard to screw the thing back up again, and it's also hard to get the spring off without damaging the spring. I'm looking now at the gap between the inner and outer part of that lens to make sure that that piece is fairly central. I'll do those two screws up. Check that that action's smooth. Check that there's not excessive play at that point. So we have two screws hold this wedge in place. That wedge I didn't remove from the plate to clean because it's tucked in underneath that rail, and I could clean it just as well without. Just nip those screws up and check the action again, make sure it's smooth and there's nothing rubbing, no rough spots. And the last screw is from this long wedge, the one that has the spring attached to the other end. I'll nip that up and I'll check the action again. It's nice and smooth. Now I'll check the action here to make sure there's not excessive movement. And I'll detect a little bit of rattle there, which means that it's not in as tight as it should be. Excuse me, of course I've got to keep the lens, the central part, centered, so I will try moving that plate in slightly, doing those screws up, see if that's tightened it up without giving me any rattle. That's pretty good. I can still feel a little bit of play there. That feels very good. I'll tighten all of those screws up. Those screws have all been locked in place with a little bit of lacquer previously. I've not found that to be an issue, and I'm not going to lacquer them in place. It feels okay. That should be good. Right, now I can start cleaning my other components and getting them back in place. I'll zoom you out for a second. So here we have the components all in order. Zoom you back in. Right, so we can start with this piece here, and I'll need to clean that with some naphtha, and I can see coming off immediately on the cotton bud quite a bit of oil, and that would have been one of the causes for the stiffness in moving the controls. You can see the state of that cotton bud, it's fairly stained. These components are all light, they're all quite thin, and they all have quite broad surface areas. So a little bit of oil is enough to sort of stick them in place. And if you try and force something to move when it's stuck in place, and if it's light and thin and flimsy, that tends to distort it. And when it distorts, it's even less enthusiastic about moving. So it's important that they run free. So I can drop this into position. Fits in here. And these counter-rotating gears here, these little pinions, it drops down to the lower position there. I can drop this spacer into place. It only fits one way, and I've only got to decide which way it fits. I think we'll fit it this way. There's a little notch in this rail that drops into. That's good. And I'll have to hook up the spring. I'll zoom you back in. That's all right. I might just run the tiniest smear of molybdenum along that spring so that it runs smoothly against that central ring there, that spacer. Otherwise it just tends to drag a bit on the rough surface. That's good. We have this component, this little cam piece here, adjusts the position of these pointers relative to each other as it follows that cam surface in there, that little crescent. I'll apply a tiny bit of molybdenum in that crescent shaped cut. And this should drop in there like that. This pointer drops on next, this ring, that needs to be cleaned. I'll move back up a bit, we're sort of losing the frame here. Again, this is a light, thin section. Quite large surface area, and it was quite oily. That would have been sticking, that oil would have been tending to stick that in place, prevent it from moving freely. Oopsie, put it in the right place might help. It has to fit over that pin on that little cam piece that we dropped in earlier. There it is. Get that sitting in there. And because it's coupled to these counter-rotating gears, I've got to make sure that it's in the correct position, that the pointer is right at the end of its travel, which is there. So both of those components are in place. This component and its spring. This component has a pin on it which couples with that little cam that in turn coupled with the last pointer that we dropped in place. And this is an external, this is the external part. This is actually moved from the outside of the lens. So again, I'm trying to get these components clean, and I've got to put this spring back on, which have come disconnected from here. I think that's will go back on there without too much fight. Right, there we go, the spring's back on. So I have to get that pin in the little hole in that cam piece. Settle this in place and hook its spring back over the post, the same post the other spring was hooked to. There we go, that's in place. So far so good. Now I have 3 screws which help me assemble this component, if I can find them. And what they are is nice long screws of the appropriate size with the heads ground off, just leaving the slot so that I can position these where the fixing screws are going to go, and they act as guides for when I fit the pieces in place, because lowering the back part of the back part of the lens mount in place is a little bit awkward. It's easy to dislodge things. Using these headless screws as guides, I can avoid dislodging stuff. Right, pop that to one side. Here we have a shim. The shim is brass. It's quite thin. It's quite easily damaged. I'm just making sure I remove any oil or contaminants from it. And I'll sit this in place. We have our final control ring here, which sits on top of that shim, which you may not be expecting. And if you try and fit it the other way around, if you try and fit that shim on top of this, it doesn't go well. So this control lever, where are we? Goes here. Let's have a look, see if I got that correct. Yeah, that looks doable. Right, I'll pop that to one side. Have to deal with the rear part of the mount now. There's almost nothing to this. We have the revolving rangefinder cam here, and that's held in with 3 retainer brackets and their screws. All I need to do is make sure that these components are clean, free from stickiness, and are very lightly lubricated. This is the cam surface that the pin on the rangefinder follows. That certainly will need a tiny smear of molybdenum in order to make sure that the rangefinder pin moves smoothly on it as it's revolved, as it's turned. The biggest effect that you feel if it's not running smoothly is not that it doesn't work, not that the rangefinder isn't accurate, but you get a funny grating sound or rough feel, which is a bit disconcerting. It doesn't really affect anything. So I'll put a little wipe of molybdenum paste on that outer edge, and some on that cam surface that the pin on the rangefinder will run on. It'll do. These little retainers, it's pretty obvious which way they go. Hang on, magnetic screwdriver's doing for me there. when everything is cleaned and lubricated and working correctly, there should be a minimal amount of drag on the control levers on the back of that lens, that the aperture blades will swing in and out smoothly and with minimal resistance and promptly. Just keeping in mind this lens is fitted here on a Retina Reflex S rangefinder camera. It is equally applicable to a Retina Reflex S or 3 or 4 camera, and so the diaphragm and aperture needs to be snappy in its action if it's to work correctly on a rangefinder camera. Right, so these components can go together. Now, what have we got to couple? Well, on here we've got a coupling here. That tab there has to couple to our focus ring at the front here. If it's not correctly placed, it won't couple, and then you'll turn the focus ring and this cam won't be doing anything at all. So I've got to make sure that I've got all my couplings and components in the correct position. This is going to go on that way. I've set my coupling up by that hole. That should go. I'll lower this in place over those headless screws. Just pulled that lever back out of the way to seat it. Now I'm checking the rangefinder pointers, the depth of field pointers here, and I want to make sure that they come to the centre at the same point. They're the same distance from the centre in both cases, and that they move smoothly, and they do. So I'm making sure that doesn't come adrift while I'm checking it. We've got 3 plain screws in there, of course. One of these is going to be replaced with the red painted screw, so I've got to keep in mind which ones I place where. I want to get one screw in to hold this assembly together. Then I can remove the headless screws, which I'd used to align everything. That was the red painted screw. That can go back in that position. I'll put a little drop of red paint on that before I'm done, but it's not in a bad state. Even though we've had solvent on there to get that screw loose and had the screwdriver on it, obviously, it hasn't removed sufficient red paint to stop the red paint doing its job. I think I just got to a file size limit there. I was just saying about the red dot. There's sufficient red paint still on that screw for it so that it still does its job of letting us know which way up the lens has to be to fit it to the camera. But I will repaint that regardless. I'm checking my focus, make sure that moves smoothly. Check the action of the 2 outer tabs, and they're moving smoothly. So I can just tighten those 4 screws up. And that is ready to have the lens capsule put back in it. And it's time for me to change my camera battery.